one of the things you touched on there is that idea of self-efficacy combined with experience, combined with the ability to reflect and make sense. And I was going to ask, have you seen that in other sort of industry sectors and other areas of work?
It's certainly something whenever we're talking about development of mental toughness and doing any kind of consultancy work with organizations, that's what we try and implement. So it's this kind of cycle of you essentially learn about yourself. You then use that added learning to aid your reflection on the experiences you have, which will help you to then hopefully deal with future experiences in a slightly better way, then reflect again. But it's always getting that relative to understanding yourself. So, which is why I like a good quality psychometric, because it gives people an understanding of themselves, and it's very easy to have an image of, if I'm going to be this role, that's how I should be. And then when you behave in a way that isn't quite how you think you should, that can kind of undermine your own kind of confidence in the role and those kind of things. Whereas if we add into that, this is who I am as a person, this is my kind of I suppose predispositions. Someone might be quite hedonistic, someone might be quite fatalistic, someone might be quite sort of likely to perceive senses of threat first and think about withdrawal and stuff like that. And I think all of that is okay. The more you understand yourself, then it means that reflection completely changes away from being, here's what I did and here's what I should have done, to here's what I did. And I suppose that makes sense, because this is why I would have done that. And then you might be able to tease out some learnings there.
I think from what you're saying there, John, it makes me just think about that idea of, if we want people to be self-reflective, um, and own a level of not being sure sometimes, um, that sort of the way in which that might cause a bit of cognitive dissonance with identity of what they think they should be like, or what they think they should be portraying, I think is quite an interesting area of risk, really, because it's an interpersonal risk, to be able to say, well, actually, I'm not sure, and on reflection, this is how I might view that situation. And that might then be seen as weakness as opposed to actually strength. And it's almost that area of vulnerability, the area of owning sort of a level of mental sensitivity sometimes, to be able to say, actually, in a reflective sort of context, I might react in these ways. That's not a good or a bad thing. It just is a thing. It doesn't mean I can't do it. It doesn't mean I won't be able to, and it doesn't mean I won't respond appropriately, but it might not look like the kind of the definition of that others might expect, or even I might expect to myself.
I think you're right, Gordon. In fact, if you look at our work, the work that we've been doing with John over the years on the mental toughness concept, in 2002, we published a version of it. And if we'd not been open to the idea that it can evolve and change, we wouldn't be where we are now. We have not a hugely different picture. We still understand the concept in terms of the basic principles, but we know it means something different. We now know that being mentally sensitive is not a problem. You can be mentally sensitive and very successful. We know that context matters, and we've increasingly understood the difference between behavior and mental toughness. So everybody talks about behavior, and behavior is the description of how I act when things happen. It's not a description of why I act
Yeah.
when things happen. And that's what we're trying to get to. And once you start digging down into that, you get into all sorts of complexity. So, and John's been doing some remarkable work on using a clusters approach, where he's beginning to illustrate that in some settings, mental sensitivity is actually a positive advantage compared to mental toughness. So, it's grasping complexity and sort of beginning to understand what that actually means, as you said earlier, for every individual. And for me, that is beginning to look at the relationship between culture, what an organization expects of you, and what you can actually bring to the organization. And from that, in my mind, there's a big gap between the two in most organizations that's still not been bridged.
I think that idea of environmental impact on behavior and sense making, which is where I think some of the why comes from, is an area that we haven't spent as much time really understanding. We've spent a lot of time understanding how certain personality traits, facets, preferences impact different things about success in places. But the one thing we haven't been able to dial up and dial down systematically in that is what are the environmental factors that are influencing some of these things. And I think there's probably a lot more work to be done in terms of, so what are the environmental factors that do have an impact, and how do they have an impact? Because I think one of the things that we understand a fair amount about are some of those facet level things, but what are the mechanisms by which they get changed or get influenced? And I think that idea of my mind keeps returning to that model of cognitive behavioral therapy, actually, the physiology, the emotions, the behaviors, and the thinking almost working as a complex interplay between each other. And so what, why, and how are playing off against each other in a way that you have to look at them all together. And I'm not sure we've invested as much time in each of those.
I think it's great to hear that, because one of the things that I often kind of run into is there's this gap, of course, between research and practice, and where I see sometimes that gap gets exasperatingly large is when the thing you've spoken about there, Gordon, isn't recognized. So what we end up with is this sort of simplistic kind of, oh, well, this is the answer to things. So everything will be fine. And then we stop learning, we stop developing. So the phrases I always use, like, that people are really complex, and the most complicated psychological framework or model is still a significant simplification of reality. So when you start seeing really simple type models, they're enormously overly simplified. And what I like to hear then is that kind of appreciation of, well, actually, there's loads of stuff that we're not tapping into, which is also quite exciting, because you'd like to think, look, it's not like we've reached a level of biological and social evolution. We go, that's it, we're done, we're finished, right? Everything's as we want, and we'll just leave it at that. So yeah, I'd love to hear that kind of exploration of the different facets and nuances and challenges.
I think we are trying to get a handle on some of the environmental factors, things like work design, workload factors, common environmental stressors, and you do see some of that in some of the models. Uh, I think in a complex, a reactive work environment, though, like first responders, what happens is that the complexity and the lack of control there is over any of those, so that you can't change them. They are as they are. And what you've got to do is then work out, well, what's the impact of those for those different people, those mentally tough, those who are mentally sensitive, those with certain preferences and certain styles. Um, and and in that environment, then working out, well, what does success look like? And is that one thing, or is that a multiplicity of things? And that might go back a little bit, John, to the work that you're doing in trying to better understand in that cluster approach of so what are the factors that are actually impacting success, and are they always the same? Well, probably not. We know that humans and environments are too complex for that probably to be true.
Yeah, and even within the human and within the environment, there's factors that influence other factors. So um, uh, taking our mental toughness model, but you could take any kind of psychological model that, that you see fit. Someone we see all the time people have an overall same score of mental toughness. Um, you might even see that someone has the same score for um, achievement orientation, so how much they'll stick at a task until they complete it. Taken in isolation, you would say, oh, this person has a high level of achievement orientation. They'll never give up. They'll stick at something. But then when you look at, is that person also, what's their emotional control look like? What does their confidence in their abilities look like? Because if they were low, I see a person who will continue to strive to do better because they don't feel what they're doing is good enough and they're feeling the negative impact of that. Whereas if those other scores are high, I'm seeing someone who's setting high standards, but probably experiencing more of a chance at, like, a flow state and performing really effectively. Equally within the environment, it's not just the interaction between the person and the environment, but sometimes we look at those factors individually. People do this in, this sounds like a complete sideways thing, but watching the Euros recently as a football fan, armchair supporters love to go, oh, well, if that guy was on the bench was playing, or if the formation was ever so slightly tweaked, it would make all the difference. No, because there's so many different factors that can influence it. And that's in an organized game. When you're going out as a first responder, where there are no rules, like, there's so many factors, each that influence one another. So you can't really say, oh, let's try and pluck this factor out and we'll do some training on that and expect it to be significantly improved, because it depends how it interacts with all the other factors. We're very sort of abstract. That's kind of why I think it's such a challenge working in those scenarios.
I think you're absolutely right, because I think the way in which we take a consumer behavior and we create sort of constructs from it. We always know, even just statistically, those constructs relate to one another to some extent. And the way in which they play off against each other is important. And I think in a first responder context, going to an event that's unpredictable is one thing, but also there's the environmental factor of what's the culture within the organization like.
Mm.
So, what's the extent to which I will be judged if dot dot dot? Um, you know, what does it mean? What does success in this situation mean and look like? What will other people expect of me within the organization, outside of the organization? Um, uh, if I do something and I make a mistake, how will that be viewed? And so the level of mental sensitivity, mental toughness probably plays off of many of those situational factors. But one of the things I do wonder whether it comes back to, it was the thing that you were talking about earlier, John, that was making me think a little bit about the reflective practitioner sort of angle of this, which is the learning orientation
Mm.
aspect of mental toughness, and the way in which that is probably a key facet of um, general reflective practice, things like growth mindset, aspects of kind of psychological safety, and the cultural context within the team, but then going beyond the team within the department, going beyond the department within the organization. How genuinely welcome, regardless of what our narrative is, are those things seen? I had a conversation with somebody who was in a first response context, not policing, just recently in a conversation, and they were struggling to make sense of having not achieved appointment to a very senior role. And it was mainly because, as we explored it more thoroughly, it was mainly because they'd never failed before.
Mm.
And this was somebody who works in a really demanding area, in a very, very demanding job, clearly able to deal with conflict, complexity, and ambiguity. But when it was then directed at themselves in terms of not having achieved something and not having achieved something that they wanted personally for the first time, it was a very, very different dynamic.
Mm. Yeah, and this is what I found so fascinating about studying individual differences, because we we sometimes make this understandable, but we attribute um, personal characteristics to people based on previous outcomes. So you see it all the time. So I see it in sport. You go and you meet some top athletes and stuff, and you think actually some of them are pretty sensitive, or they do question their ability and stuff like that. Um, just because someone's extremely successful doesn't necessarily mean that they're an excellent learner. They might, like you say, they might never have had to. And I think that also has an effect when you if you're delivering something to people, chances are people in that room are a normally distributed sample. So if you're the facilitator, the coach, the psychologist, whatever you are, you might be high on learning orientation, and you kind of have to catch yourself to think, maybe I'm the outlier, maybe I'm not normal. If I'm on a standardized 10, if I'm an 8, then I'm the one who's not normal. And those people over in the corner there who just don't seem to want to engage in this kind of reflective process
Mhm.
as much, they're not wrong, they're normal. I think that's what you get. And that's what I have to be able to do as someone who's facilitating. I've got to bring the whole distribution along, not kind of just go, I'll help the people who are already really good at reflecting and learning to keep doing it.
I think what is interesting that is that idea of trying to meet people where they are, not where we'd rather they were. And I suppose that's that principle of inclusion in practice, isn't it?
Yeah, I,
And I think when you think about that on really large populations, when we look at our health sector, it's one of the largest employers in the UK. And when we look at policing, as I say, 240,000 employees, approximately 150,000 police officers, 90,000 police staff, again, we tend to think of first responders in terms of demands and resources and uh, from the job we understand, police officers. But actually, there's a whole multiplicity of people behind that, which some actually do some really, really challenging work. So call center, the contact center, call takers, the dispatchers within those areas. They're the people who get that traumatic call. Um,
mm,
we've got the likes of crime scene investigators who are not officers. We've got civilian investigators who are not officers, and they're coming into traumatic kind of situations on a regular basis. And I think thinking about populations of people in terms of how do we do this inclusively without making people feel like they should be something they're not.
mm,
We should all be mentally tough, or rather than seeing the benefits of mental sensitivity, or we should all be open to change, or we should all be learning and reflective. That's actually creating a sort of an expectation, another expectation, which ironically might be a stressor for people who are not that thing that we are suggesting they should be.
Just
yeah.
moving on tangentially, Gordon, you produced, and we were involved in it, an interesting piece on the danger of belongingness and the potential downsides of team working. It's kind of relevant to everything we've spoken about. Do you want to just talk a little bit about that for a moment?
Yeah, thanks, Doug. I've got an interest at the moment about belongingness and the way I think belongingness might be a key mechanism for a whole series of other things. So it's quite a narrow sort of idea, but I think it's actually a mechanism that in fact affects a lot of other things, things like psychological safety, for instance, where I think one of our natural human tendencies is to want to belong to something, and it becomes a fundamental part of our identity. And therefore, trying to be part of a team is a really great thing. And then when we're in a healthy environment and a healthy team, and where we are psychologically safe and where we can express ourselves properly, that's optimum. It's lovely. It's great. But actually, not everywhere's like that. And actually, not everyone thinks in the same sorts of ways as we were just saying before. One of the challenges I think is how do we create healthy belongingness in organizations, so healthy teams in that sense? Because on the one hand, our natural motivational need to want to belong is helpful because it helps us to get to be cooperative, collaborative. It leads to probably a set of interdependent relationships and behaviors. It leads to trust. Um, but when our need to belong becomes stronger than our need to speak up about things that may be unethical, I think there's potentially quite a dark side to team belongingness. And in that space, I'm wondering, and again, there's not what I would say about this is belongingness is spoken about a huge amount by people currently, but when you look at it, there's not a great evidence base around belongingness, and I think that's something that needs more work and something I'm currently trying to do some more work around. But I wonder, and I suspect this is true, where somebody needs to belong and to protect the fact that they are accepted as part of the team, they are willing to get involved in inappropriate or unethical behavior so they're not ostracized. I think there's a key issue for many, many organizations there. And so, in practical terms, the whistleblower within the NHS who doesn't blow the whistle because they don't want to be then ostracized by the organization for being a troublemaker, the person who doesn't bring an employment tribunal. In fact, I talked to somebody just yesterday who has been in this situation. They took an employment tribunal and then were subsequently bullied and harassed in a workplace because they were seen as not being on the team. What they raised an employment tribunal about, and it was found in their favour, was clearly a legitimate issue for organisational learning. They ended up ostracised. And so, what does it look like when people don't speak up, when good people don't do the right thing, and when we become complicit by silence? We don't whistle blow, we don't raise an issue, we don't raise an ET because we don't want it to damage our reputation. Um, and within policing, I do wonder whether when we look at the likes of the Casey review, the Angelini inquiry, these sorts of things where the WhatsApp groups where there's clearly inappropriate behavior, where people know it's racist, homophobic, misogynistic behavior that's not right, but they do nothing. And I think doing nothing is easy to criticize, but I think we first need to understand it from a behavioral perspective. What leads to this idea of doing nothing? And I wonder if belongingness is a key mechanism and the fear of loss of belongingness.
That happens a lot in the world of people in organizational development. You get a phrase, it becomes very popular, and people see it as a one-dimensional concept. So belongingness, everybody talks about it. It's a good thing. It can't possibly be bad. But people don't dig underneath the surface of too many concepts to understand what that concept might mean in different contexts. So I think what you picked up on there is really interesting because everybody just plows into team working and belongingness as if it's the solution to the big problem. it can create its own set of problems.
I think so, and I do think get leaning into that space of healthy belongingness. But I think we first need to understand what do we mean by healthy belongingness versus unhealthy belongingness, and how do we create healthy belongingness versus unhealthy belongingness? And I think it's quite interesting because as I said, I think it might be a mechanism for psychological safety,
Yeah, yeah.
almost a precursor for psychological safety for the behaviors of speaking up, sharing ideas, genuinely interdependent collaboration. So I think dependency behavior on others is potentially unhealthy. I think independent behaviors is potentially unhealthy too. And somewhere in the middle, some sort of interdependent, collaborative sort of behaviors are probably a healthy space. I'm not saying dependency and independence are by their nature unhealthy. I think there's situations where both of those things are absolutely required. But I think this idea of psychological safety and interdependent, collaborative, speaking up, cooperative behavior within teams, we immediately step into, oh, that's all great, but let's do that. And it's interesting, I think, that in the systematic review that Amy Edmondson herself produced in 2023, one of the conclusions was we still don't know enough about how to create psychological safety. So there's a lot, and I think that it links to your point, Doug, which is ideas become sort of popularized, and we then don't spend enough time scrutinizing them and thinking about, right, also, how does that work? What are the mechanisms by which that works? Because if we want to genuinely replicate and create that in organizations, we need to understand because that's what we're trying to replicate. Otherwise, we try to replicate this general idea, um, and we haven't got a mechanism for doing that. And being more willing to sort of step into the space of, well, actually, we need to understand more to do that properly is I think a really good thing to do. I just think we don't do it enough, and then the market gets swamped with the language
Mm.
and the hype of the idea, and unfortunately that can be a problem.
You've you've scoped out a great proposal for a full PhD there, Gordon. I tell you that's
I'm glad you
um,
got that, John. I'm currently just working with a couple of colleagues for a proposal for a prof doc on it.
yeah, yeah, good. Because I'd love to see it go somewhere. Um, and it what I really liked it says that it's you said it's easy to criticize people for being silent, and if albeit there's a replication crisis in social psychology where a lot of sort of conformity type um, studies are not replicated very well, but time and time again what we see is ordinary good people staying silent. So it takes a certain level of arrogance to think, well, I wouldn't do that because I've got my values and I would do that. Yet, if that was true, it wouldn't be as widespread. This kind of silence is, as humans, we're just fallible to that, and I think you might be hitting on why that might be, and that kind of just balance between. But yes, you have values, and you may feel very strongly about them, and you certainly can sit there in a hypothetical situation and say what you think you would do, but you also have this need for belonging and attachment and all those kind of things as well. And whereas in the right environment, that's a brilliant, amazing thing.
Well, I think this has been a very thought-provoking and sometimes dark podcast. I think you're going to leave the listeners with a lot to think about. If anybody wants to know more about you and your work and contact you, how do they get hold of you?
So probably the easiest way is through LinkedIn. So Gordon Ryan at Prism Work Psychology on LinkedIn is probably the easiest way to get hold of me. Thanks very
Thank you
much.
very much, Gordon. That's been really interesting.